In a must-win game for the Winnipeg Jets, they once again found yet another way to lose, this time to Chicago on the road.
You're Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day, and, of course, helping to make Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. Tonight's show, we have a lot to recap. Obviously, yesterday, Winnipeg went to Chicago and promptly got itself shut out 2-0. Not exactly what you would expect on a game where Chicago was coming in with 4 straight losses, and the Jets were 4-0-1 in their last 5. You would have thought that there was some, spark, some sign of life, and certainly the Jets played decently well, but, poor puck management, all that stuff kind of contributed to spoiling Toews' return back to Chicago for the first time since he ended up kind of stepping away for a couple of years. We'll chat about that, about the emerging trade market with Kiefer Sherwood now off to San Jose. That might have an impact on the Jets. And, of course, Winnipeg later tonight taking on the St. Louis Blues for a back-to-back. But first, let's chat about Winnipeg versus Chicago. By all accounts, if the Jets wanted to have any sort of hope of clawing back in the playoff race, a game like this was 100% a must-win. Zero question, the Jets had to get points out of this one way or another. Didn't matter if it was pretty, didn't matter if it took overtime or a shootout. Winnipeg had to get 2, and they got 0. Not only did they get 0 points, they got 0 goals. And I didn't really expect that, to be honest. I thought that this was a game, especially with how the Jets were playing in the opening period, where they'd score at least 1. But somehow Spencer Knight ended up shutting the door on the Jets' offense. The top line, I thought, had some decent chances, but really struggled to do some of the usual top line stuff that you're usually used to. And the second line with Toews, I thought, did reasonably well. Again, also could not score. Just one of those games where you're a bit snake-bitten. The Jets definitely out-created Chicago in net. But I will say the Hawks created some really dangerous chances off of a lot of really sloppy turnovers and mistakes from the Jets skaters. The Jets defense was also looking a little different. We had Sandberg and Schenn and Isaac Phillips paired with Logan Stanley. This was the result of Salamonson being a little bit sick, so he ended up sitting out. Bit of a tough one for that blue line unit. Salamonson, I thought, had looked really great his last couple of games, and here he has to sit due to illness. That puts a lot of strain on a Jets defense that's not particularly good. But here, I thought, against Chicago, who's been ailing themselves, it wouldn't be as much of a problem as it was. And I suppose in some ways it wasn't. I mean, Schenn, Stanley, and, Phillips and company kind of did their part. And Sandberg, I thought, did okay. But ultimately, you just didn't really see enough from this team, right? The first period or so, there was a lot of urgency, a lot of back and forth chances. Then the second period slowed down. And by the third period, Chicago started to really kind of shut up or shut down shop, which against Winnipeg is probably not the happiest thing for Jets fans to see. If you are getting stifled by the Blackhawks in 2026, you might have some bigger issues. That's just kind of par for the course for the season. I think it's been, a tough go for the Jets, right? Whether they're leading, trailing, tied, it doesn't seem to matter. They just find different ways to drop results. And it's been one of the biggest reasons why, despite winning 4 in a row recently, the Jets really gained very little ground. The teams above them either got extra points or, they already had a fair enough lead to where the Jets winning a couple of games really didn't move them up the standings much at all. So the Jets are still kind of in the same place. And with this loss, they're now 3 points back of both Calgary and Chicago. They're going to be playing the Blues later tonight, who are just 2 points ahead with an extra game played. So this is another really big result potentially in the standings, which we'll talk about later this episode. But I think what I come away with is like the biggest thing that happened in this game was that the Jets gave, a nice showing for Toews. He had a good night. He got a big standing ovation that lasted a couple of minutes from the Hawks fans, and that was really the highlight of the evening. The rest of the game, I really can't say too much about it. I think Hellebuck had a couple of really crazy saves. He had one or two moments where maybe he would have wished for the one goal against from Dickinson not to have leaked through him. And maybe Sandberg thinks he should have gapped that a little bit better. It is what it is, it just it is what it is. That's all I can say is it is what it is. But Hellebuck did make one stunning save on the PK that I thought was another highlight moment. He leapt across the goal and somehow snatched a puck out of the air that I thought was for sure going to be a power play marker for Chicago. It wasn't, and somehow kept the Jets within reaching distance of this game. But in the end, didn't matter, right? Team Tank still rolling on, and I think the more that people see the Jets continuing to not get points here, the louder the calls for this team to sell are going to start to become. The Jets are where they are, right? They're not really gaining points. They're not gaining positioning in the standings. I think people need to kind of start to wake up, and other teams are already selling, right? I think this is a bigger point. The longer you sit and wait, there are a couple of ways this could go. If you don't want to sell, I understand. But other teams are getting the jump on the market and potentially setting some of the early prices. That could work to the Jets' advantage if the supply of potential players for sale goes down, but that also means that the demand may also be going down as teams fill their needs. So the Jets need to be very careful about how they handle these next few weeks. This is potentially a really big opportunity for Winnipeg to make some smart moves, to start to trickle some guys out to other teams. And based on the returns we're seeing early on, I think the Jets could come away from the next few months with some really solid draft picks and assets that can help them kind of turn this ship around in the subsequent seasons. But right now, the team is still very, steadfast in the belief that they are not going to give up on the season, that they're going to keep fighting. I get it, but I can tell you one thing, they really have no shot at this point. It would take a miracle run, and, I've said this before, I just don't think it really matters this year. Your miracle run could get you a matchup with either Vegas or Colorado in the first round. And yes, the thing that matters for the Jets more than anything is gate revenue. They would love a couple of games of home playoff revenue. But if you're serious about the longer-term health of the team, I think at this point we can start to really count the Jets out in terms of the playoff race. They do still technically have time to completely change this and turn it around, but they're going to have to start winning these games where they continue to drop points and do so in rather frustrating fashion, right? These are moments where you play bad teams, and if you think you are seriously a playoff contender, you have to win it. There's just no excuse. If you lose it, you're probably just not that good of a team, and I think the Jets certainly know this now. I think that they've been wise to it for a while. I'm sure the players are really frustrated. I'm sure Arneal is frustrated trying to get this team to generate offense and score consistently. It's been a real trial and a half, and it does not really seem to be improving despite some brief spurts of offense here within the past week or two that maybe gave fans a little bit of hope. But the past couple of games, I think, serve as reminders that the Jets are in the hole that they're in for a reason. They didn't get here by accident, and, how they play these next couple of weeks out is going to be ultimately, the first start of either trying to claw back in the playoff race or starting the selling conversations. But speaking of selling, the trade market is well underway. We talked about the Rasmus Anderson deal yesterday. We also saw the Kiefer Sherwood deal, and the Sherwood one could really hold some interesting insights for the Jets when it comes to moving some of their veteran forwards. We'll chat about why coming right up. There's nothing like being near the ice during hockey season. The speed, the hits, the atmosphere, it's unmatched. Watching at home is great, but being in the building is a completely different experience. The only thing that used to get in the way was actually getting tickets. Long queues, endless screens, and prices changing at checkout. That's why the Gametime app gives the advantage back to fans. It's the hack for unlocking amazing NHL tickets and experiences in just a few taps. I've used Gametime to buy Ravens playoff tickets. Really could not be easier. I had panoramic seat views. They showed me some of the best prices and seats for the value in the whole stadium. painless, quick delivery. And best of all, you also had priority fees included, so you know your total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. We all know how it sucks when the prices suddenly change as you're putting your credit card info in. And you can know that your tickets are always backed by the Gametime guarantee to give you real peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying NHL tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's show as we are talking a little bit about the Kiefer Sherwood deal that dropped and broke earlier yesterday. Obviously, the Sherwood thing was probably one of the bigger trades when it came to this deadline that a lot of folks have really been eyeing up for a good reason, right? Sherwood is one of the more in-demand players in this whole, I would say, trade deadline group. When it comes to expiring free agents, not many guys have the goal scoring and finishing ability that he does. And he's been talked about as being, a more versatile player perhaps than just, a poacher and finisher. I would say he's kind of like Drew Stafford on drugs, a much more well-rounded player, a surprisingly forceful forechecker, and, he's got some pretty solid passing in hands. But in terms of his overall game, I still think that there are certain limitations to where, if you're expecting him to make you an elite team, probably not. But for the Sharks, Sherwood actually makes a fair bit of sense. San Jose brought him in from Vancouver for 2 second-rounders this year's and next year's, plus a defenseman, I think, who's a minor leaguer. And in a lot of ways, the Sharks are kind of in this interesting spot of being in a playoff spot in their division, but maybe not feeling 100% confident just yet. They're only 2 points above the wild cards, and I'm pretty sure they feel to some degree that they need to shore up the offense, kind of shore up a few other areas. They're one of the only teams in a top 3 divisional spot in the West that has a negative goal differential. So there's a lot of stuff for them to kind of work on. But the reason I think the Sherwood deal is especially interesting for Jets fans is because the Jets have started to have conversations internally about what they do with this roster, right? And those conversations have sort of been percolating within the media and press, which is a big deal for the Jets. Usually, any of that stuff isn't really actively discussed until later for this team. But because the Jets are 31st in the NHL, it's okay to have these conversations now. I've said for a while that the Jets need to start considering selling. They're getting closer and closer to that decision point, whether they want to be or not. And the guys that they could potentially let go, they might not be the sexiest names out there. People might look at the Jets roster and think, well, what could you realistically get for some of these guys? The first name that I think legitimately has some true trade value in terms of forwards is like a Nino Niederreiter, right? Niederreiter has a little bit of term. He's, on a fairly inexpensive contract, $4 million for, the next season. And he's a pretty proven 30-odd point scorer, right? He's a guy who does really well in the forecheck. He's versatile. I've talked about him before being, a solid middle 6 contributor. If you were to be able to get like a 3rd and a 5th rounder for him or something of that nature, I think you feel pretty good about that. He's not going to get you 2 seconds. I don't see that really being the case. But if you get a couple of solid depth picks, maybe one as high as like a higher 3rd round pick and something else, I think you would be pretty okay with that. And opening up some roster space and cap space isn't really something to sniff at either. If you're the Jets, you do need to kind of give yourself some flexibility here over the next season or two to really make some changes to this team. Another guy that hasn't really come up, but could potentially be moved if the Jets decide to go that route is Al Iafallo. And I think Iafallo might actually have surprising amounts of value. He's a player that I could see getting a 2nd rounder, just extended, pretty recently. He's got, 2 more years after this at 3.67 mil or so. That's pretty good value for a guy who's shown that he can play a defensive bumper on the top line. He's, a very solid middle 6 and bottom 6 player. He does PK work. He can be on the power play too, which he's done plenty of times and has actually collected a couple of goals there. He's a nice tertiary scorer. And yes, there are going to have to be some veterans who stay behind to play for the team because you can't just tear down the whole roster. But if the Jets are trying to figure out who should be let go, who makes the most sense to keep around, guys like Nino and Alex might be some of the first cuts the Jets look to make. In terms of like a Gus Nyquist, I mean, at this point, Nyquist is basically like a 5th-round pick, is my guess. Maybe you retain some of the salary for this year. I mean, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. It just means maybe you can facilitate the trade a little bit faster. He's been benched a lot recently, really hasn't been getting much game time, has almost no real goal contributions besides a couple of assists. It's not really been an impressive run for him. And, a lot of us probably warned that this could happen. All that said, I don't think I expected him to score no goals, basically. So that's been a little bit of a disappointment. And look, it's not all entirely on him. I think he does help you tilt the ice, and he does really good work in transition. But, the other parts of his game haven't really been a fit for what the Jets frankly need right now. Nemesnikov is one of the other guys that I think has kind of been bandied about as a potential trade option. I think if you get a 3rd-rounder for him, that could be useful. I'm not really expecting huge returns, but he's got another year at $3 million. He has versatility. If the Jets play him out at wing, I actually think you could pump up his trade value a fair bit. When he's a winger, he's like a very different player than when he's being asked to be, a middle or bottom 6 center. I just don't quite understand why Winnipeg has really tried to force him at 2C. And I get that they think that they have no other options, and perhaps that's partially true. But even Lowry, I think, brings more of a two-way presence and has more of that offensive bent in terms of just sort of crashing the net and stuff, rather than Nemesnikov, right? Like Vlad is more of a defensively oriented guy. And so I think the fit has never quite been ideal. But if you send him to a contender looking to maybe, capitalize on his ability to be a really solid forechecking winger with a decent set of hands, Vlad could maybe get a bigger package than I'm expecting. Again, I don't think most of these players really bring you a huge return, but they might get you some 3rd-round picks or something. You might be able to get something out of that higher than you might expect. But again, it's going to be a little tricky here. The money for the Jets, obviously they're going to want to be careful about what they let out and what they keep and how they balance the books. And some of the teams that they might be trading with are going to be conscientious of that as well. Tanner Pearson probably going to go on to another team. He's only $1 million this year and not too expensive. The 2 forwards that I think have the most trade value as of right now are Toews and Barron. And Barron, I don't really see being moved just yet. But given the Sherwood deal and stuff, it is a conversation that at least the Jets should think about if they get a good offer. He's not really a player you have to trade. And if you want to sit on him for a year, that makes total sense to me. I wouldn't really be averse to that. He's a player that you can probably keep around for a couple of seasons. Just, be aware, he is 27, probably going to be 28 here pretty soon. And you have to think about the timeline for where you want this team to go. If you think Barron's not going to be a player that's really important for your next couple of seasons, then maybe you trade him to get a pretty big trade return package, potentially, a low 1st-round or high 2nd-round pick, especially given his salary. He might fetch you a bigger package than you realize. So that's one angle to consider. But if you also think that he is going to be a player that sticks around for a couple of seasons more, then, you're not really in a rush to do anything with him. But just with the kind of market that we have right now, this is probably one of the better sellers markets that we've seen, especially this early. The other guy that has a surprising amount of trade value is going to be Toews. JT is obviously committed to the Jets and is very happy to be here, but, the Jets are almost last in the NHL. He signed on to be part of a contender. And if this doesn't really work out, maybe he's agreed to move to another team and become, a competent bottom 6 player for somebody else who can kind of match the sort of tempo and skill set that he brings. I think he does take some real work to make function in, a major scoring role, but with guys like Perfetti and Velarde, they've proven that you can find a way to make it happen. And it's led to him really, scoring quite a few goals and points recently to where he looks more like a middle 6 center than he did at the start of the season. So he might have some legit trade value. And with some of his bonuses already paid out, the other team's not going to be on the hook for those necessarily, just the future stuff that has yet to be met. And if the Jets can find a way to make that all happen, maybe they get a bigger package than I thought. Maybe you even get like a second and a fourth or something out of the Toews deal, which would be really, really good for the Jets, I would think, especially given that, you brought him in as a free agent. He's a little bit pricey in terms of dollars, but if you get that trade value in terms of some prospects and assets, the Jets amateur scouts can probably give you some really good value out of the selections. So lots of stuff to consider. But, the Jets, I think, can really fortify a lot of the margins with a lot of these players. And that could be one of the more beneficial things that they do as they head into whatever the summer is going to be. It's going to be a very busy offseason, I think, and we might see a lot of change for this team. It's really going to have to sit on Chevy's shoulders to see if he has figured out any of what has gone wrong this season and if he can find a way to sort of move past some of his own previous mistakes. But before then, the Jets still have plenty of games to play, and one of them is later this evening against the St. Louis Blues. We'll talk about what to expect coming right up. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for rejoining us on tonight's show as we're just wrapping up really quickly with some thoughts of Winnipeg against St. Louis. Yesterday, obviously, the Jets lost in a shutout to Chicago, so not super great there. The Blues, for their part, just got blown out by the Oilers 5-0, so they're probably feeling pretty pissed off too. The Blues are kind of all over the place this year. They're kind of playing 500-ish hockey recently. Listen, right? Like, they know that they're sort of out of the playoffs. And Doug Armstrong has very much said that pretty much everyone's on the shopping block, right? He's not really married to anyone. And if there's a deal to be had to reinforce this team's future and make the most of it, even if this team somehow does stumble into the playoffs, he's going to really consider it and probably make the move. So this is the kind of mindset that I think would be helpful for Winnipeg. Now, again, publicly, I know why the Jets are very hesitant to make that commitment and why they haven't said anything yet. So just bear that in mind. But I think this is the direction that for a team like the Jets could still give, both camps something to work with. You're happy to make the playoffs, but you're also understanding you need some assets to restock the pool and get this team in a better position. So in terms of what the Blues might roll out, we're probably going to have something like Shen, Neighbors, and Snuggerud on the first, Holloway, Dvorsky, and Kyrou on the second, Stenberg, Bukestad, and Buchnevich on the third, and then Toropchenko, somebody else for Sundqvist, who apparently got injured in the last game, and Walker. On the back end, you'll have Broberg and Parayko, Tucker and Falk, and Fowler and Mailloux. This team is very leaky, right? And Binnington and net really hasn't been super impressive. Hofer hasn't exactly been the world's best backup either. And this team has a lot of injuries, right? Joseph's kind of been in and out. Pia Suter is out. Thomas is out. So there's a lot of firepower that's missing for this team, and the roster that they already have right now is just, it's very mid. In many ways, I think the Blues and Jets are kind of in somewhat similar positions. It's just that the Blues, I think, tend to be more aggressive in trying to resolve this. Sometimes they do a good job. Sometimes they make some strange moves. But I think for the Jets, right, you're going to be coming in pretty early this morning. You're going to be tired, and I don't know how they're going to react after getting shut out by the Blackhawks. Sometimes when you lose, you feel more motivated to push and stuff, but you're facing a rested Blues team. You might just not have the energy for this game. The Jets, frankly, if they want to even talk about the postseason, have to get points out of this game. At this point, it's looking less and less likely. The Jets will be at home, so that's a big advantage for them in terms of the home atmosphere and the rink advantage that they tend to feel. But does that matter against a rested Blues team? I don't really know. A Blues team that's also going to be pissed off. I thought that they were going to have a really good shot at beating Chicago because Chicago had been on a losing streak and looked like garbage, and it still didn't matter. So it may not matter for this game against the Blues either. For both teams, I think there's some pretty significant standing stuff here. If the Jets drop this result, either 1 point or 2 points, they lose. it's a pretty big swing, right? You could give either St. Louis 47 or 48 points out of this, and that is a fairly noticeable difference. Now, if the Jets were to get 2 points, obviously they'd be 1 point behind the Blues, even if they have to do it in overtime. So, they'd be pretty close. But if it is a full 2 points that they drop in regulation, the Jets are 4 points back of St. Louis. They'll be, right behind Chicago and Calgary again by about 3 points. So this is a fairly sizable gap, especially with, how the Jets have been recently and how they've struggled to get standings points in general. 3 or 4 points can be pretty crucial towards the end of the season. We are 2 games away from the 50-game mark. Tonight's game will be game 49 for the Jets, game 50 for the Blues. We are really in the back stretch of the season, and if the Jets can't find a way to get something out of this, they're just kind of furthering the conversation that this team should sell and prepare for a really big draft prospect. Later this week, actually, you'll have a couple of episodes. I'm going to be out of town starting tomorrow, so we'll have an episode recapping Winnipeg versus St. Louis and talking about some of that stuff. But on Thursday and Friday, you're going to have some previews of some of the top prospects from picks like 1 to 8, I would say. I think this year, more than any other season for the Jets, really could be something that saves this franchise. This Jets team kind of stumbled backwards into a major draft pick. And, even if they somehow slide to 7th or 8th at the end of the season, which I know some of you have been commenting, there's still a chance they come away with a really good prospect. But they really, really, really need to stay in that 1 to 4 range. They don't have to win first overall. It'd be great if they did. But, as long as they stay in that top 3, top 4 range, they are pretty much guaranteed a game-changing talent and somebody that potentially could step into the lineup in the next year or so. That would be a godsend. It'd really help this Jets team out. And I think it would give the boys a measure of confidence and a real morale boost to know that there's help coming in the immediate future. The Jets do have some reinforcements elsewhere. I don't know if they really trust those reinforcements right now, so I'm not considering them too much, but a major draft pick and perhaps a philosophy change this summer could really shift how this team starts to approach things and gets them set up for next year. So yet again, after a big game against Chicago and a big loss, this is another big game with huge standings implications, potentially, pushing the Jets more and more towards that conversation about starting to hit the sell button. We are getting into the waning weeks of January. We're almost to Milan in a couple of weeks. It is getting closer and closer to the point of no return for the Jets. And a lot of you may be upset about that. I think that there's fair reason to be upset, but I promise you the pain that we're going through right now will be worth it in the end, especially when the Jets walk away with a Stenberg, a McKenna, a Lawrence, even a Veerhoff or some other top prospect. It will move the needle for this team. So later this week, we'll talk about which of those prospects move the needle the most and who you should really be excited for. Maybe some prospects to question whether they really make the most sense for the Jets. We'll chat about that later. But for tonight's show, that's all the time that we have. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.